Scientists examine Nefertiti's statue and discover a secret that changes everything. Join us on this epic journey through time. Like and subscribe now to be part of the discovery. Unlike many other tombs in ancient Egypt, King Tutankhamun's burial site stayed hidden and untouched by grave robbers for 3,000 years. One big reason was that the tomb was smaller than usual and tucked away in a place called the Valley of the Kings. By the time explorers got to that area, they had already dug around a lot, so Tut's tomb didn't stand out. In fact, the entrance was completely covered by debris from the construction of a nearby tomb, which helped keep it a secret. There weren't any writings or markings outside either. Time itself also played a huge role in preserving it in incredible condition until the 1920s, when a man named Howard Carter finally broke in. But was Carter really the hero everyone thought he was? Some recent findings suggest he might have been a lot sneakier than people originally believed.
I wasn't just some lucky treasure hunter. Before finding Tut's tomb, I was already a serious archaeologist, deeply obsessed with Egyptian artifacts. My interest started when I was a kid, and soon enough I was sketching sculptures and carvings from ancient tombs. After finding King Tut's remains, I spent a decade cataloguing and processing all kinds of treasures, like golden thrones, chariots and statues, shipping them up the Nile to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Or at least, that's the official story.
Recent discoveries hint that not everything made it to Egyptian officials. There's even a secret letter that spills the beans about Carter's personal 10 for them, 1 for me policy. This letter, dated 1922, was sent to Sir Alan Gardner, a linguist and a close friend of Carter. In another letter from 1934, Carter casually asked Gardner for advice and thanked him by sending a small charm as a gift. Carter insisted the charm wasn't from Tutankhamun's tomb, but surprise, surprise, it was clearly identical to one from the tomb's collection.
Gardner wasn't too thrilled to be dragged into this mess. After comparing the charm to the artifacts from Tut's tomb, he realized it was an exact match. Feeling pretty stuck, he wrote back to Carter, frustrated, but still chose to protect his friend. Instead of exposing him, Gardner simply advised Carter to return the souvenir to the museum in Cairo. Just like I'm advising you to like this video and subscribe to Brightside for more amazing history content.
But that wasn't the only shady thing about Carter's behavior after the big discovery. In 1947, a man named Alfred Lucas, who had worked with Carter, revealed in a little-known Cairo magazine that Carter had secretly broken into the burial chamber before the official opening. He supposedly resealed the door afterward, pretending nothing had happened. Why would he do that? Well, the theory is that Carter and his crew snuck in early to grab some ancient goodies before anyone else could get their hands on them. Obviously, they couldn't risk selling those priceless items while they were still alive. But after Carter's passing, some of these artifacts mysteriously ended up at auctions. Carter, of course, never officially admitted anything, but he didn't outright deny it either. Still, the Egyptian government wasn't willing to take any more chances. They banned him from the tomb for a while to prevent more disappearances. Some people even link these events to the infamous curse of the pharaoh. If you've never heard of it, the idea is that anyone who disturbs King Tutankhamun's tomb would be cursed with terrible luck. No, it's not quite like mummies coming back to life in a rage, but stories started spreading about mysterious and untimely deaths of people involved with the tomb. The most famous case was the death of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a British aristocrat who helped fund the tomb's excavation. He died just a year after the tomb was opened. Sounds spooky, right? But in reality, Herbert was already in poor health when he arrived in Cairo and ended up dying from a pretty ordinary illness.
Let's look at the numbers. A lot of people were involved in opening that tomb. Archaeologists, security guards, staff members, you name it. Sure, a few of them died not long after the tomb was opened to visitors. But as much as we'd all love for this curse to be real, because hey, it makes a great story, statistically speaking, in a large enough group of people, some are bound to pass away sooner than others. When it comes to opening ancient tombs, it's only natural to expect a few random deaths by coincidence. In fact, the average lifespan of those supposedly cursed by King Tut's tomb was over 20 years after the curse was said to have begun. Herbert's own daughter lived well into the 1980s, more than 50 years later.
Even Howard Carter himself lived until 1939, a full 16 years after his big discovery. Some people believe this whole curse thing was actually a smart PR move. You see, when King Tut's tomb was first found, Carter wanted to keep nosy reporters away, so it's possible he cooked up the idea of a curse to scare people off from disturbing the boy king's final resting place. But what was actually stolen from Tutankhamun's tomb anyway? Well, for starters, some jewelry, probably taken by Carter himself. A French expert did some serious research by comparing old photos from inside the tomb in the 1920s with items that later showed up in museums and auctions. Little by little, he pieced together where some of Tut's missing jewelry ended up. For example, there was a large collar necklace that used to lie on Tut's chest. It got smashed into pieces, and parts of it somehow found their way through Carter to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Missouri. Other fragments ended up in a private necklace owned by unknown collectors, who even tried and failed to sell it in 2015. The Nelson Atkins Museum has since confirmed this info on their website. Then there's a headpiece with beads that clearly belong to Tut. Those beads were also taken, probably by Carter, and later made their way into a necklace now displayed at the St. Louis Art Museum. Another fancy collar made of glazed ceramic charms spent some time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Luckily, that piece was returned to Egypt over a decade ago, but again, yes, it was Carter who swiped it. Even though some artifacts went missing, King Tut's tomb still gave us tons of amazing treasures that taught us a lot about ancient Egyptian culture. The most iconic, of course, is the famous golden burial mask, a 21-inch masterpiece made of gold, semi-precious stones, and glass paste. It weighs 22 pounds and shows the boy king with a long beard and a headdress decorated with a cobra and a vulture. There's also a spell from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead carved onto the mask, meant to guarantee Tut's success in the afterlife. Turns out Tut was a fan of board games too. Archaeologists found 4 of them in his tomb, some made from ivory. They even discovered a pair of golden sandals, though let's be honest, those were more for show than actual comfort. Most likely the pharaoh never even wore them. And when it comes to fashion, Tut was quite the stylish young ruler. They even found a mannequin in his tomb, which he used to organize his clothes and jewelry. Apparently, the boy king also enjoyed music. 2 trumpets were discovered in his burial chamber. They were even played in a BBC broadcast back in 1939, though today they're far too fragile to be used again. Here's a fun fact. In November 1922, a young boy wandering through Egypt's desert stumbled upon some ancient steps carved into the rock. That small discovery turned into one of the biggest archaeological finds in history, the untouched tomb of Tutankhamun. Inside, archaeologists found around 5,000 artifacts, including jewelry, fabrics, ornate jars, and funerary masks. You've probably seen the most famous one. It's one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt today.
Now, more than 100 years later, humanity might be on the verge of another massive discovery: Cleopatra's tomb. Cleopatra was the last active ruler of Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, reigning from 51 to 30 BC. There are tons of ancient records about her reign and her larger-than-life personality. But until now, no one has been able to solve the mystery of where she was buried.
Enter Dr. Kathleen Martinez, an archaeologist who has spent decades studying ancient texts and temples around Alexandria. She believes Cleopatra's tomb is hidden beneath the ruins of an ancient city called Taposiris Magna, founded in 280 BC. This was a large, bustling city on Egypt's northern coast, home to tens of thousands of people working in trade and industry.
Turns out, my hunch might be spot on. My team and I recently discovered a secret underground tunnel near Alexandria, stretching about 0.8 miles, carved deep into the rock beneath the Taposiris Magna temple. During further excavations, we uncovered several clues suggesting Cleopatra's tomb could lie at the end of that tunnel. There's even a possibility she was buried there alongside the Roman general Mark Antony.
According to ancient records, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were deeply in love and stood together against the Roman Senate, which, as we know, didn't end well for them. Antony is often called a traitor. The fact is, natural disasters have been hitting the area of Taposiris Magna for thousands of years, which complicates excavation work. Earthquakes and floods have damaged the city and possibly flooded its underground tunnels.
But we are hopeful the ancient tomb is still intact. possibly hiding treasures and records about royal life during Egypt's last dynasty. Of course, there's a chance the digs will get stuck in mud, which means it'll take a lot of time and funding. Still, we're convinced it's worth it.
It's too early to say for sure that Cleopatra is really buried there, but so far they've found many clues in the tunnel, including pottery, dozens of coins with Cleopatra's face and Alexander the Great's, and even a bust of the Queen herself. Cleopatra remains one of Egypt's most iconic figures, right up there with Ramses III and Tutankhamun. She's inspired countless movies, paintings, and books. What made her so famous was her fascinating contradictions. She was a smart, beautiful ruler who pulled Egypt out of crisis and turned it into a thriving power.
Medieval Arabic texts even say I was skilled in chemistry, math, and philosophy, and that I may have written several scientific books. I spoke multiple languages and had excellent diplomatic skills. At the same time, many legends describe me as a femme fatale who drove men mad. But there's no solid proof that my beauty was truly unmatched. That image mostly came from Hollywood, which loved casting glamorous actresses as me in films.
The Roman Emperor Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, helped shape her image as a cunning seductress because she was his enemy. Even though Cleopatra was born in Egypt, she wasn't ethnically Egyptian. Her ancestors were Greek, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. Still, she embraced Egyptian culture, learned the language, and deeply respected the country's traditions. She knew Egyptian history, culture, and mentality very well.
I boosted Egypt's economy and strengthened its global power. A lot of this was thanks to my cleverness and political savvy. I also loved grand shows and luxurious celebrations. I knew how to surprise people and put on a spectacle. But behind the glamorous facade, I was a sharp, calculating ruler who did everything I could to grow Egypt's wealth and influence.
For example, when she was at odds with her brother in 48 BC and knew she couldn't defeat him directly, she came up with a bold plan to win Julius Caesar's support. Caesar had just arrived in Alexandria, and Cleopatra wanted to meet him. Knowing that her enemies might block her way, she ditched the fancy entrance and had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, wrapped in a carpet or linen bag according to some versions. When the carpet was unrolled, Cleopatra appeared. Her beauty and boldness impressed Caesar, and the two became close allies and lovers. Later, Cleopatra also charmed another powerful Roman, Mark Antony, for diplomatic reasons. She arranged to meet him dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, sitting under a luxurious canopy with servants dressed as cupids, waving fans and burning incense. Cleopatra put on this extravagant show because she knew Antony admired Greek myths and considered himself the embodiment of Dionysus. Her plan worked. Antony was so taken with her that he married her. Cleopatra defended her crown, strengthened her alliance with Rome, and had 3 children with Antony. In Egypt, they threw lavish parties and lived in luxury and power. But their high-profile relationship caused a scandal in Rome. Octavian, Antony's main rival in the power struggle, seized the opportunity to smear Antony's reputation. Through propaganda, he portrayed Cleopatra as an evil seductress and accused Antony of being bewitched by her. The Roman Senate sided with Octavian and declared Cleopatra an enemy in 33 BC. This conflict eventually escalated into a full-scale war. Antony's fleet clashed with Octavian's forces at the Battle of Actium. Octavian won, forcing Antony and Cleopatra to flee back to Egypt. According to some historical accounts, they sought refuge near Alexandria, hiding in one of Cleopatra's palaces. Eventually they both died, though the exact details are murky.
One legend says I, an expert in poisons, let a venomous snake, possibly an asp or an Egyptian cobra, bite me. Another version claims I pricked myself with a poisoned hairpin. There's a theory that I always carried a small vial of poison hidden in my hairbrush. When I was finally cornered, I supposedly dipped a needle in the poison and pricked myself.
But honestly, no one knows for sure. Scientists are still trying to uncover the truth. Maybe if they ever find Cleopatra's tomb, we'll finally get some answers about her tragic fate. Cleopatra was the last ruler of ancient Egypt. After her death, Octavian, later Augustus, looted her palaces and temples, then returned to Rome, where he became the first Roman emperor. He ruled successfully, expanded the empire's borders, and reigned until he was 75 years old. History could have turned out very differently if Cleopatra and Mark Antony hadn't lost that naval battle. By the way, did you know that more time passed between Cleopatra's reign and Neil Armstrong's moon landing than between Cleopatra and the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza? Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969. That's 2,038 years after Cleopatra was born. Meanwhile, the Great Pyramid was built way back in 2560 BCE, so Cleopatra is actually closer to us in time than she is to the pyramids. That's how long Egypt's history is. When people hear the word mummy, it usually gives them chills, mostly because we think of scary characters from horror movies. But in reality, mummies have helped us learn so much about ancient civilizations, their rulers, and how people dealt with losing their loved ones. The most famous mummies in the world come from ancient Egypt. The Egyptians believed in some form of life after death, but only if certain conditions were met. That's why they went through the trouble of preserving bodies through mummification and placing them in well-furnished tombs, like giving the deceased their own fully equipped apartment for the afterlife. Why did they believe this? Well, the Egyptians were very connected to nature. They noticed how the sun rose and set daily, how plants would grow again after withering, and how life seemed to come back in cycles. They also believed in the powerful god Osiris, who symbolized death and resurrection, playing a key role in the afterlife. To prepare for this journey after death, the ancient Egyptians followed specific rituals like mummification. This involved using substances like honey, resins, and incense to preserve the body. No mummy is more famous than that of King Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut. He was a young pharaoh who ruled Egypt over 3,000 years ago. The problem with finding ancient royal tombs is that most of them had already been robbed long ago. People knew pharaohs were buried with valuable treasures, making tombs obvious targets for thieves. That's why the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 was so exciting. It hadn't been looted like many others. It was hidden so well that it remained untouched. Inside, his mummy was found wrapped in 3 coffins, including one made of solid gold. The treasures found in his tomb gave us amazing insights into life in ancient Egypt. Studying his mummy also taught us about the culture and everyday practices of that time. Through DNA analysis, scientists discovered he suffered from malaria and had a foot problem that likely made walking difficult. Another famous pharaoh was Ramses II, who ruled Egypt for 68 years. A really long time back then. He was known for his military campaigns and ambitious building projects. Many monuments from his era still stand today, including a huge statue of him. Ramses II was about 6 feet tall and lived to be around 99 years old. Studies of his mummy suggest he had a spinal condition inherited from his mother. Remember those tomb robbers I mentioned earlier? They might be the reason Ramses II ended up in a plain coffin hidden in a secret royal mummy cache at Deir el-Bahari. This hidden spot was rediscovered in 1881. Luckily, archaeologists could still identify his mummy because his name was recorded on the wrappings, but it was a tough job. In fact, mummification itself was an intense process. In ancient Egypt, it could take up to 70 days to complete. Special priests performed specific rituals while carefully drying out the body using a type of salt called natron. They used linen and resins to preserve the body's shape and then wrapped it in layers of cloth. The tombs were just as important as the mummies. For example, King Tutankhamun's tomb walls are covered in detailed artwork showing his journey to the afterlife, from his funeral procession to his passage through the underworld. The ancient Egyptians believed that everyone would take this journey after death, so they filled their tombs with essential items and paintings to help them on their way. To help the dead on their spiritual journey, the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs were often decorated with spells from a special book. This book contained poems and incantations that Egyptians believed would guide souls safely to the afterlife. They took this journey very seriously. People even placed food inside these tombs. In King Tut's tomb, archaeologists found 36 jars filled with ancient drinks and 8 baskets of fruit, all left there to help him on his way to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed this journey could take a long time, so they stocked up the tombs with supplies like food and water for their loved ones. Pharaohs were also buried with luxurious clothes and beautiful jewelry to make sure they traveled in style. These items included fine linen outfits like tunics, scarves, gloves and headdresses, along with lots of gold jewelry with precious stones. Bracelets, belts, necklaces, rings, and even little protective charms shaped like insects. Some tombs even contained fans made of ivory and ostrich feathers to keep the pharaohs cool in the afterlife. Some rulers went even further, equipping their tombs like eternal apartments. For example, Pharaoh Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza as his grand burial site. In King Tut's case, though no actual boat was found, archaeologists did discover many oars and boat paddles, suggesting he was prepared for a journey. Interestingly, he was also buried with 3 chariots and several canes made of valuable materials, hinting that maybe he preferred traveling by land rather than water. One of the coolest things found near ancient mummies were bottles of oils and perfumes. After all, if these rulers were going to look good in the afterlife, they might as well smell good too, right? Some tombs even had ancient board games made from expensive materials like gold or ivory. One of the most popular games was called Senet, kind of like ancient Egyptian chess. Although Egyptian mummies are the most famous, they weren't actually the first to invent mummification. That honor goes to an ancient South American civilization called the Chinchorro. As far as we know, they started mummifying their dead around 2,000 years before the Egyptians developed their own rituals. By studying mummies, we've learned a lot about ancient rulers, but until recently we had no clear idea what they really looked like in life. That changed when archaeologists found special mummy portraits, highly detailed paintings of individuals from ancient Egypt. These portraits, often painted on wood, are much more realistic than the typical statues and wall carvings we're used to. Researchers have even used these portraits to diagnose health conditions by comparing them to the corresponding mummies. Interestingly, some of these portraits even show jewelry that was later found on the actual mummies. The recent discovery of more mummy portraits in central Egypt is a big deal, as it's the first time in over a century that such artworks have been found. Mummies have appeared all over the world naturally too. Sometimes mummification happens without human intervention, simply due to environmental conditions like extreme cold, intense heat, low oxygen, or accidental exposure to certain chemicals. These conditions prevent bacteria from breaking down the body, allowing it to stay preserved for thousands of years. One famous example is Ötzi the Iceman, a man who lived around 5,000 years ago in Europe. When his body was found in the Alps in 1991, Austrian authorities at first thought he was a recently deceased hiker because of how well preserved he was. But after further examination, they realized he actually dated back to the Copper Age. Now imagine it's nighttime, you're about to step into the final resting place of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. You know King Tut, of course. You didn't bring a flashlight, but at least you've got your phone's torch. You go down a few flights of stairs, noticing how the walls are carved with hieroglyphs and what looks like a warning spell. It says that anyone who steals from this tomb will be cursed forever. Even if you don't believe in curses, it gives you a bit of a shiver. You come across a massive stone door. Is it a trap? Carefully, you manage to open it, but it's just an empty chamber. You check your map. It looks like you're still on the right path. Subscribe and help us rediscover the forgotten past. Like, share and support the journey of uncovering the truth beneath the ruins. See you next time. The adventure awaits.